Shabbat Shalom. This is a quick video on the book The Five Gospels. What did Jesus really say? The search for the authentic words of Jesus. The translation and commentary is done by Robert W. Funk, Roy W. Hoover, and the Jesus Seminar. The Jesus Seminar is basically scholars who have agreed on a certain approach, methodologies of historical criticism in assessing and determining the probability or improbability of what the historical Jesus might have said. You can sit. You can come and chill. Sit down. Jump in the video. Hang out. Yeah, come on.
I'm doing pretty good.
All right. I'm joined here by a buddy. We recorded this earlier, and I went on at some length, and I hit the wrong button, and it didn't record, so we're just recording a quick redo. Perhaps it'll be a little more condensed, and perhaps not. Perhaps it'll be a little more refined, and perhaps it'll wander into different territory again, and into perhaps deeper territory. So the Jesus Seminar has some traditionalist, more traditionalist scholars, and plenty of what would be called revisionist scholars, many of which have different approaches to one another. However, none of these scholars is taking the approach of the Christian Church, which is, if it's in the Bible, Jesus said it. Even though there are people engaged in this academic discourse who might think that way, there are generally agreed upon rules of methodology now in historical Jesus research that sort of in-house debate is no longer acceptable. What's meant by in-house debate versus public debate is that a type of source criticism where you just say the Bible says this, where to prove something you cite that it's actually said in a text, which is a normal sort of religious discourse. That is an in-house debate. You're debating what a text says or what a tradition maintains based on citing it in a religious source. That, however, has no bearing on reality of what was actually said by a particular historical figure to be differentiated from that figure as they appear as a character in the mythology that evolves and is generated by the religious tradition in question, whether any tradition. So here, the Five Gospels and the work of the Jesus Seminar is trying to get at looking at the source material of the Christian Gospels, the canonical Gospels. We know as historians, Jesus didn't say all this stuff. We know that because some of them have the same quote but phrased a little differently. We know that because much of them is narrative that we know the narrator is saying, and some of them narrate the same events in different contexts, so some of them believe that they happened in different contexts. If people aren't aware of that, it's simply because they haven't really read through the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John in enough detail and in comparing and contrasting them to realize that that's what's going on. So, particularly Christians will be aware of what's called the Red Letter Bible. So, the words of God, and from the Christian perspective, Jesus, as the Christian incarnation of God, are in red letters to indicate these are what he said. That's still a type of source criticism that's in-house, because it's saying if Jesus is quoted as saying this, then it means he said it. The Jesus Seminar then said, well, let's take red pebbles, and we'll all sort of cast in our pebbles and vote on which of those words we think Jesus actually said. Because we don't think he said them all, so if we think he said them, we're going to put in red. And this was playing on the idea of the red letter Bible, but it wasn't buying into it. It wasn't to say, these are the words of God. It was to say, these are the words of Jesus. And it was somewhat tongue-in-cheek. So if he didn't say it at all, and everyone's 100% sure that he didn't say it, like the words of narration, so you notice here, most of this page is black. Bold black. If they're almost 100% sure he did not say it, it's emboldened black pebble. So, if they're pretty sure he did not say it, but they're not 100% sure, then it is in gray. If they think he might have said it, but they're just not sure, it's not enough. It's not characteristic enough of the historical Jesus based on using the probabilities and methodologies of determining historicity or probable historicity. Then they put it in pink. So red, pink, gray, black. Most of this is black. So it says the 5 Gospels. It compares the canonical Gospels and it compares Thomas. But it is assessing them in such a way, not saying this one source is more reliable or less reliable. All of them have black, all of them have red, all of them have pink, all of them have gray. So, let's see right here. No, in pink, no one can enter a powerful man's house to steal his belongings unless he first ties him up. Only then does he rob his house. They're saying Jesus probably said that. Probably, maybe, is really what they're saying, because it's pink. So it's not red. They're not like, yeah, he almost certainly said it. It has, why? Because it's different enough from prevailing traditions and also from church doctrine, dogmas, and approaches that we can be sure it wasn't just invented wholesale. It's weird. He's talking about robbing somebody. He's trying to compare his activity to this and his activity to something atypical. So when he's talking about a government being divided and Satan driving out Satan, he's explaining that his activity can't be from Satan or Satan because he is in his activity doing harm to Satan. So if his activity is empowered by Satan, it only serves to reason that he couldn't be acting against him. So that's where he gives this analogy, where he likens his activity to tying up someone and looting their house. So, well, we could say, well, that's fine because it's Satan, it's Satan, it's the adversary. It's atypical from what we would expect. He's comparing the activity of a robber to his own activity. So that's different, and that's why it gets a somewhat probable assessment. So similarly, we have all of this. Well, and actually, let me go back to that really quick. I don't need to go through all of this. The point is to give you an idea of what the approach is. So that's the only thing that they put as at all probable. Now, right after this is a definite and almost certainly improbable statement. I swear to you, all offenses whatsoever, whatever blasphemes humankind might blaspheme, whatever blasphemies humankind might blaspheme, will be forgiven them. Okay, so read it again. I swear to you, all offenses and whatever blasphemies humankind might blaspheme will be forgiven them. But whosoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit is never ever forgiven, but is guilty of eternal sin. Almost certainly improbable, because it bears no resemblance to these other statements from Jesus, and it represents and reflects later church Christian dogma. So when it does that, when we find something that represents and reflects later dogma of a religious tradition, we can be almost 100% sure that it was interpolated by someone later. So this is what this work is engaged in, the Jesus Seminar is engaged in, and they have another book, just the Parables of Jesus, and it does the same with just the parables. And the parables are some of the most almost certain historical material from the Gospels, not simply because they reflect a Jewish manner of teaching, which would have been dissimilar to the church and similar to the milieu of Jewish sectarianism in the Second Temple era that Jesus was immersed in and interacting with, but because the nature of the parables is dissimilar also from the prevailing Jewish mashalim, in that it's not a straightforward message. It's a message that's flipped on its head. What you would expect to be the moral of the story ends up being flipped on its head. The example I'd like to give, and that I sometimes give, is, I gave the example of Thomas's assassin parable in the Revelation video. But in the Synoptic Gospels, there is this notion of the kingdom of heaven, which when the kingdom of heaven is said, we can understand from a Jewish Talmudic perspective that the kingdom of heaven does not refer to heaven. It does not refer to anything but the Messianic kingdom. Now, there's some discussion in historical Jesus research about what Jesus meant by this. So he says the kingdom of heaven is within you. So some people, particularly scholars familiar with the Christian context and not the Jewish context, will say, see, he can't be talking about the normal Jewish messianic kingdom idea here, because, and then they tell you why, based on their understanding, he couldn't have been. So they'll say, because that was supposed to be this type of kingdom or whatever. Well, that assumes that his belief in that kingdom was consistent with prevailing ideas. When he says the kingdom of heaven is within you and all around you, and the kingdom of heaven is in your midst, what he was saying is in the communalistic activity of his disciples, their approach, the communalistic attitudes and practices that were Essene derived, in that activity itself is the Messianic kingdom. Within you is the Messianic kingdom. Within what you are doing here and now is the Messianic kingdom. That's what he was saying. So he's saying you don't have to wait for it. So today, Chabadniks talk about Mashiach now. And this is not a new concept in Judaism. Every messianic trend, every messianic movement, even going back to Jesus in Judaism, predating Christianity and Christianity's use of Jesus, had this idea of Mashiach now. And when Jesus spoke about the kingdom in your midst, the kingdom within you, that's, in fact, what he was talking about, is the notion of Mashiach now. Now, he didn't mean it in the sense of, I'm your Rebbe, so you have Mashiach now. In fact, when he asks, who do you think I am? And he's given this answer, he says, tell no one of this in Mark. Not necessarily because he was denying it, and not necessarily even because he was waiting to see, although both of those are possible. Maybe, let's see. But because it was irrelevant and unimportant, and he was understanding that this is what his disciples and Peter were thinking, And he was understanding that that's why Peter was on board. You're on board because you want to be part of this installment of a messianic kingdom. But don't go around telling people this. This is irrelevant. So that too we can assess as almost certainly historical. So the mashal that I would like to give as an example, and I'll leave on that note, that Jesus gives that turns everything on its head, aside from the assassin and Thomas, which you can see in the Revelation video, part 1, is about, he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a woman. So this, right off the bat, kingdom of heaven is like a woman. We read that now. Our pastor says, the kingdom of heaven is like a woman, Jesus said. It loses all meaning. If you would have understood it in the context of ritual purity, and even particularly Essenic purity, the notion that the Messianic kingdom is like a woman would have been a revolutionary statement, and it would have been an appalling statement in some cases. But he doesn't leave it at that. So a woman with her menses, who has to be purified, who has niddah, who has to wait for sexual intercourse to be acceptable, the kingdom of heaven is like a woman. So right there, he's, by saying something so different from what we've heard, from what we've thought, he's calling us to think deeply about, to ponder how and in what ways is the Messianic kingdom like a woman. That statement alone is a parable. So he goes deeper. He says, not only that the kingdom of heaven, that the Messianic kingdom is like a woman, but that the Messianic kingdom is like a woman who is trying to hide leaven, yeast, chametz. She's trying to hide it. Now, traditionally, the role of the woman was to, and I say traditionally, not that this is the way things should be or whatever, but traditionally, and the way that it still is in many communities, is the woman does this very difficult job of spring cleaning for Pesach. She cleans out, hunts down all the chametz, scrubs it out of the sink everywhere. The refrigerator gets all the chametz out, and it's very taxing. So this woman, she wants to hide the chametz. So far, everybody's with Jesus. They're like, okay, the kingdom of heaven is like a woman. But then he flips it back. He's playing with you. Kingdom of heaven, Messianic kingdom is like a woman. What? What did he say? Who has some yeast that she wants to hide, has some chametz that she wants to hide. They say, oh, okay. Well, okay, it's a woman. She's getting rid of the yeast. Okay, getting ready for the yeast for what? For Pesach, of course. Pesach, because Pesach symbolizes redemption and liberation of the Jewish people, or of all who are captive, even. So, in the Second Temple era, under Roman occupation, this was a potent metaphor. And Christianity made use of this metaphor with the crucifixion story. And that's also something that's probable. There were numerous revolts around Pesach on an annual basis, minor revolts. And so Rome would execute troublemakers using crosses, Jewish troublemakers, not troublemakers who said theology that they didn't like, but troublemakers who wanted to overthrow the Roman government. These were the only people they crucified. And if revolutionaries and would-be messiahs, that was all they crucified. And that's why they say that this thing was nailed over Jesus that said King of the Jews, etc. It would have been Rome saying, here's your King of the Jews, now it's time to go home. So that, anyway. So, in this metaphor, the kingdom of heaven is like a woman who's trying to hide some yeast, some chametz. And they say, oh, okay, well, I see where he's going with this. And, the kingdom of heaven is, she's getting rid of the yeast for Pesach. Okay. But then he flips it on its head again, and he says, So she takes the yeast, the chametz, and she hides it in dough. She then takes the dough, kneads the dough, and hides it in a cupboard. So she doesn't take the chametz and sell it to the goyim. She doesn't take the chametz and throw it away and burn it. She takes the chametz, kneads it in the dough, and hides it in a cupboard. Now this is completely the opposite of what anyone would expect. So, because it's the opposite of what anyone would expect, there's two things that we should bear in mind. Number one is that it's almost certainly historical. The parables represent some of the most probably historical material recorded about the historical Jesus. So, but the padding of it, the narrative, no. But the actual mashalim of Jesus are almost certainly historical, at least most of it, some of the phraseology different perhaps, but because it's so different from what you expected. So he's telling you that. He's trying to make you think the Messianic kingdom is different than what you think. It's not a man coming, to conquer. It's a woman. It's something that you don't think is coming. And this woman is not scrubbing out the chametz, burning it. She's kneading the chametz in the dough, and she's hiding it in the cabinet. Now that right there has just melted everybody's mind. Now when a pastor says this today, it doesn't make any sense. And because Christianity has so divorced the historical Jesus from his historical context, theology, practices, teachings, and appropriated him for a deviant Edomite theology and religion that is Christianity, because of this, normally Jews don't pay attention to the Jewish parables of Jesus, the Jewish teachings of Jesus. Historically, the movement, which in Arabic is called the Isawiya, in Judeo-Arabic was called the Isunim, or the Isunia, did and encouraged people to study the words of the historical Jesus, and from a gospel account that they had, a singular gospel account that they had. That's another story. But it is to say that there is Jewish precedence to encouraging people to study these words within a Jewish context, a non-Christian context, and that this was done by a movement which we know from our historical sources, both Muslim sources and Karaite Jewish sources, by a movement which was fully embraced by the Rabbinites and seen as consistent with rabbinical Judaism, maintaining the same traditions, maintaining the same holidays as rabbinical Judaism, and yet accepting Jesus and Muhammad as prophets, as they were historical figures. That's not to say accepting the mythological characters of Jesus and Muhammad as prophets, but to accept the historical Jesus and the historical Muhammad as prophets, and to be even more strict, to be a Nazaritic movement that eschewed alcohol consumption and animal flesh, that made Shema Salat, or advocated rather, Shema Salat 7 times a day, consistent with the Psalms or Tehillim, saying 7 times, that 7 times day and night we praise God. So this has precedence, and I would encourage anybody who's a critical thinker in any Jewish tradition, in any Christian tradition, any Muslim tradition, to re-explore the words of Jesus with a critical eye to the padding of the narrative and the interpolation of authors interjecting and interpolating their own ideas. This book is a good tool for that. It's not to say that everything they have in here is right. This is their attempt at it. And when they do the parables book, there's some that they reevaluate and reassess, and some things they say are more historical, and some less historical. So I disagree with them on the assassin one, which and some teachers that I've had have disagreed with them as well, in that that's almost certainly historical. But in the parables book, they don't assess it as such. I think in here, there are a number of things that they assess differently when they do the parables book. So that's not to say that their assessment is what's right, but the approach, the methodology, the critical approach to understanding that just because it's in the record of what someone supposedly said does not make it true, does not mean that they actually said it. It means you have to approach it in this way with a critical mind and a critical eye. So I would highly encourage you to do that, and I'll leave you with that thought.